In a world spiraling into darkness and chaos, only a handful dare to stand up and push back against the insanity that is quickly shadowing and extinguishing what's left of light and truth. In this no-holds-barred podcast with truth directly from the Word, Michael is one such voice, punching through this darkness to dispel the deception and lies being pushed on this planet from all sides. Buckle up, place your trays in the upright position, enjoy the ride. Bullet points.
Diabolical, an adjective, belonging to or so evil as to recall the devil. Example of usage: his diabolical cunning. Synonyms: devilish, fiendish, satanic, demonic, hellish, infernal, evil, wicked, ungodly, unholy. Tonight, in the shadow of the last cast, putting a doctor under the scope, who in his perpetrating the pre-trib rapture fantasy, I figured we'd go once more around the ride to see just what these doctors are up to. And as much as I hate to subject the listener to this type of vomit for the sake of not being accused of taking the Dr. Andy Woods, out of context, utilizing such short clips as I did in the last cast exposing Chuck Missler, this clip is a bit more lengthy, but I strongly urge the listener to pay close attention, as this interpretation is sweeping through the church at an unprecedented pace that most will never know just how diabolically deceived they are once biting into this apple.
There are many misunderstandings concerning the teaching of the rapture of the church these days. And here to discuss some of the misunderstandings and in particular an interpretation of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is Dr. Andrew Woods. Andy Woods. I'll just call you Andy, okay? Mm-hmm. And Andy, you have prepared a lecture on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, which is getting a lot of traction these days. A lot of people really love the way you present this particular section of the Bible, and I think you do a wonderful job, and that's why you're here. I want you to kind of expound on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Mm-hmm. It's an important passage.
Right. Well, yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. But, 2 Thessalonians is really written as one of Paul's earlier letters. It's probably his third letter. And he's actually been pushed out of Thessalonica by unbelieving Jews, and he's in Corinth, and It's sort of like leaving your babies behind. He looked at these new believers as his children, spiritually, who he had won to Christ. Mm-hmm. And they don't have a New Testament to consult. Mm-hmm. They don't have Prophecy Watchers TV to consult. You don't have any institutions or seminaries. And the guy that you've learned from, the apostle, has been pushed out. And lo and behold, they get this forged letter telling them that they are actually in the tribulation period, which I think unsettled them, because in 1 Thessalonians, Paul explained to them that they would be removed from the earth before the tribulation started. So there's lots of eschatological prophetic confusion, kind of like today. But you can imagine how that would be exasperated when you don't have a canon of the New Testament to consult.
They don't have the New Testament. This is what, about AD 51?
51,
So it's early in Paul's writing period. So they don't have a New Testament they can turn to. No book of Revelation.
Right.
And the Gospels, so forth. And yet Paul has taught them something that we consider an advanced idea these days. And that's fascinating to me. They're kind of baby Christians who would tend to believe what Paul wrote to them. And naturally, they would be a bit confused if someone came along and tried to sell another idea.
Especially in Paul's name.
Yeah.
Because when you go back to verse 1 and verse 2, it's apparent there's some kind of forgery, letter, spirit, prophecy, something allegedly coming from Paul saying the day of the Lord has begun. Now, they had learned the opposite from Paul. So Paul from Corinth writes to the Thessalonian believers. And I think what he's doing in chapter 2 is he's telling them you're not in the day of the Lord. Because if you were in the day of the Lord, you would see a sequence of events, like the Antichrist in the temple, and the Antichrist's miracles, and the Antichrist being overthrown by Christ himself. And right in the midst of it, he says this in verse 3, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come." Now that's in italics, which means that's been sort of added and to kind of smooth over the translation, but it's referring back to what was called the day of the Lord in the prior verse. "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." And it's this interesting phrase here, you're not in the day of the Lord because there hasn't been a falling away. And it's the Greek noun apostasia. And your typical interpretation of that these days is this is just talking about a spiritual departure. You know, the spiritual departure of the world to follow the Antichrist in the tribulation period.
That Greek word apostasia has been anglicized into our word apostasy. And so it'd be easy to kind of think of that in that way. That's what the Greek word says, and that's what the English word says, end of conversation.
End of conversation. And most Bible translations today, we can get into this a little later, but they translate it as some kind of spiritual departure. So a rebellion, a revolt. Some use the word apostasy. But the fact of the matter is and that's the only view I knew for many, many years. But upon further study, there's a whole different view of this. That the noun apostasia could mean not a spiritual departure, but an actual physical departure, i.e. the rapture. Now, the reason this is so significant is it says the falling away shall come first. It's that Greek word proton. And if this indeed is talking about the rapture of the church, Paul is very clear that the rapture of the church occurs first. And that settles the long-standing debate, doesn't it, that we've had for the last several centuries on when does the rapture happen relative to the 7-year tribulation period. You know, as you well know, there's pre-tribulationalists, our view, mid-tribulationalists, post-tribulationalists, then you have pre-wrath rapturists. Then you have another view called partial rapture, and it's a lot of confusion as you get into that debate. But if Paul is actually saying there's going to be a physical departure first, in other words, before the man of sin comes and the tribulation and so forth, then it's sort of game, set, match. You know, there's no reason to debate this anymore. So that's why how you define apostasia here becomes a big deal.
And many people use this as a proof text for the church going through the tribulation, which you and I don't believe. So we have then a major discussion underway here. How do you interpret this? And what we're talking about here is this letter from Paul which acknowledges that there are forgeries circulating, apparently under Paul's name or some other authority, saying that, wait a minute, the day of the Lord has already begun, and the tribulation has already begun, and we're in it. And we then have to begin to behave a certain way, apparently. What would be your motivation for saying that the day of the Lord has already come and that you're in it? Would it be to gather followers unto yourself? In other words, you become a kind of a leader of a group of people, and you say, I'm the one that can sort of take you through the tribulation?
I really don't know what the motivation of the proponents of the false doctrine are, but I know the angelic motivation. It's always to cause confusion, and it's to undermine what the apostles have said. And there's always an agenda by Satan to remove the Church of Jesus Christ from apostolic teaching, because once we cut that cord, we fall prey to anything. So Satan somehow is using these imperfect vessels, the proponents of this false teaching, to bring confusion.
Okay, now, here's where it gets interesting. And your presentation on this is fascinating because you offer 10 distinct reasons why a particular term in the Bible is to be interpreted a certain way. Let no man deceive you by any means, verse 3, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. And this term falling away, translated from the Greek apostasia, is a fulcrum. It's a balancing point around which everything else sort of stands or falls. And you offer 10 reasons why that term falling away should be interpreted not as falling away, but as physical departure. It's talking about the physical departure of the church.
Right.
And you've studied Greek, and you understand it, and you understand the tradition of translation. So go from there.
Yeah. Well, before we get to the 10 points, I think Paul is just making a very simple point here. He's saying, you're not in the day of the Lord, you Thessalonians, despite what you've been misled to believe, because you're still here. In other words, your presence on the earth proves you're not yet in the day of the Lord, because there has to be a physical departure, i.e. rapture, before the day of the Lord starts. I think that's what Paul's point is.
Okay.
So now to these 10 points, why would I understand this word apostasia as a physical departure? Well, the first reason is there's always been spiritual departures. Today, you can talk to Mr. and Mrs. America about their local church, and they're upset that their own local church has spiritually departed. So how would a spiritual departure be some kind of, definitive sign, of the end times? And one of the illustrations, I like to use to prove this is Harvard College, founded in 1636. And you go back to its original doctrinal statement, and it says, let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly expressed or pressed to consider the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ at the bottom as the only foundation of sound knowledge and learning. And seeing the Lord only giveth wisdom, let everyone seriously set himself by prayer in secret to seek it of him. Everyone shall exercise himself in reading the Scriptures twice a day, that he shall be ready to give such an account as his proficiency therein.
At Harvard. Now, I don't think the credo of Harvard is being observed today.
Yeah. And
so what's happened?
There's been an obvious spiritual departure. And, you can look on the evangelical landscape and see institution after institution that was started on godly principles that has departed. And this idea of spiritual departures is normative, sadly, in our age.
And so when you read it here in 2 Thessalonians, you're not looking at a spiritual departure would not be a unique event.
Yeah, how could that be a unique sign? it would be, just another day in the news.
Right.
So that's sort of my first reason.
Okay.
The second reason is this book of 2 Thessalonians is really one of the earliest letters Paul wrote. So he wrote Galatians first, most believe, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, and the last days apostasy is really not a massive subject in Paul's earlier letters. He does talk about the Galatian heresy, but that was an apostasy happening, right then and there.
Right.
But when he begins to forecast, when he begins to predict the last days apostasy, you really don't get much treatment on that until you get into the pastoral letters, particularly 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, and then Jude and Peter, written around that same time, get into that subject in depth. So it just seems sort of out of harmony that Paul would broach that subject so early on when his custom is to deal with that subject later in his ministry.
And if you look at 2 Thessalonians as a letter, the whole letter, and we won't have time to do that today, but essentially the letter says, here's what's true, and I want you to wait patiently for Christ. Mm-hmm. That's the subject matter. It's really not talking about what's going to happen when people fall away from the faith. As you say, those are the later letters of Paul that deal with those subjects. Mm-hmm. But this letter is the patient waiting for Christ.
Because they were in the midst of suffering.
Yes.
And it's sort of hard for a suffering church to be apostate. And so it's kind of a different scenario in Thessalonians than when he starts to develop later elsewhere. By the way, I really think Paul really gets into the subject of the apostasy of the future when he begins to describe the last days of the church to the Ephesian elders at Miletus. He gives a tremendous speech to those elders in Acts 20. And around verse 26, 27, 28, right on through verse 31, that's when he begins to say, from your own number men will arise and distort the truth. So it just isn't really a big subject that Paul deals with early in his ministry. It's really not until the third missionary journey that he gets into the subject of the apostasy. But the third reason, as you look at verse 3 carefully, in front of the word falling away, at least in the original Greek, the noun apostasia is a definite article. And traveling through the verse where it talks about the son of perdition, who we think is the Antichrist, there's a definite article there. So just like the manifestation of the Antichrist happens at a specific point in time, I believe he comes forth with the opening of the first seal judgment in Revelation 6, the rider on the white horse.
You serious? Wow. Dr. Woods went off the deep end, though very diabolic in his presentation nonetheless. Sorry I subjected you to all that, but for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, you needs know what you're up against. Apostasy is now, according to this doctor, a falling up, not away. A physical departure from this earth, no less. Now what's the word say? 2 Thessalonians 2. Now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming, and you should know which coming this is by now, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto him, that ye be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Remember ye not that when I was yet with you, I told you these things? Now, in this skit I clipped, because one should ask of themselves, is this doctor for real? This doctor presented us with falling away as the catching up, a magician's sleight of hand on the mind. To the word we go. Strong's 646. Apostasia. It's a feminine noun, and in its outline of biblical usage is a falling away, a defection. Let's hear it used in Scripture. Acts 21 and 21. And they are informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. And of course, we heard it in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 3. Now, did you catch what was being spoken of in its other usage in Acts 21:21? One more time. And they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. I hear rebellion in the translation of apostasia, to forsake Moses. So we've got apostasia used as falling away and forsake. And in these two usages, I've heard nothing about a directional moving of anybody being removed from this planet in any rapturo thus far, but let's finish up. In the root word etymology of the Greek apostasia, it is derived from apostasion, Strong's 647. In its outline of biblical usage, we read divorce, repudiation, a bill of divorce. Now let's hear the verses it's used in, Matthew 5 and 31. It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. Matthew 19:7. They say unto him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? Mark 10:4. And they said, Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. Now, nowhere in any usage we've heard thus far of this word from the Greek do we get any inkling of any catching up. What we do get is a falling away from the truth, a divorcement from the faith, rebellion, lawlessness, either by choice or under persecution. It matters not. A falling away is a falling away, is a falling away. Diabolical are these doctors if you've not the gumption to look into the word for yourself, but instead choose to swallow these false teachings hook, line, and sinker. And it ended off in that clip with him asserting that the man of sin, the son of perdition, his revealing would be in conjunction with the first seal. Yeah, and we left off with a laugh in that. I ask that you go back to podcast 1 and hear all about those riders on those horses. More to come. Blessings to you and yours in Jesus' precious and mighty name. See you soon.
Bullet points.
Wake me up.